webinar of the 2024 Rural Resilience Series. I'm Haley Shipp. I am the Communications and Outreach Lead with the Ranchers Stewardship Alliance. And this is the fourth year that we have done this series, and our numbers keep on growing every single time that we bring this forward. With this in mind, this is our official invite to let us know if there is a certain topic that you want us to look into for 2025. We would like to get those all scheduled by this fall. Basically, it's almost April. Once we blink, it's going to be fall. So I'm saying act now. If you have anything that you would like us to look further into and then present in a webinar format next year, you can go ahead and give that in our post-event survey, or even drop us a note here during this chat session. That's absolutely welcome too. So each of these 2024 webinars are recorded, and after the fact, we edit them up just a little bit. We put them onto our YouTube channel. Angel DeVries is our executive director. She's also serving as the tech support tonight, and she'll be dropping a link to our YouTube channel into our chat right now. So go there, check it out. We've got a lot of great video content. Make sure to hit subscribe. I've been personally getting myself to try to reach the goal of 1,000 subscribers for our YouTube channel. We're not there yet, and so this is your guilt moment tonight. If you haven't yet subscribed to our YouTube channel, please do so. So some housekeeping before we get into this. Upon entry, your microphone was muted, so please pay attention to keep that microphone on mute. Towards the end of the webinar, there is going to be a Q&A type session. That's going to be run via the text chat feature. So I'll be taking your questions and giving those to Dr. Haggerty that way. But in the midst of Dr. Haggerty's presentation, we do have a few breakout group discussions that are going to happen. So you'll be toggling back and forth on your microphone during those. You've been warned. This is going to be an interactive webinar tonight. So who are we? Why are we bringing you this information? Well, the Ranchers Stewardship Alliance is a rancher-founded, rancher-directed nonprofit. We have a board of directors that bosses Angel and myself and our team around. They're not that bossy, but they are all ranchers who determine the path and where we're going within the Ranchers Stewardship Alliance. Physically, our office is located in Malta. In this region, we excel in showcasing how responsible ranching is good for the rural communities that we live in and the wildlife habitat that we support, constantly working with non-traditional partners to provide support, monetary and otherwise, to ranchers that want to improve the resilience, had to get the word in there, of their operations. And while we geographically do have some limits with the hands-on projects that we facilitate, that could be things like well drilling or fencing or reseeding, the educational branch knows no bounds. And that's what brings us here tonight as we look at this concept of rural resilience. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get into tonight's presentation. Dr. Julia Haggerty is an associate professor of geography in the Department of Earth Sciences at Montana State University. She holds a joint appointment in the Montana Institute on Ecosystems. She received her BA from Colorado College in Liberal Arts and her PhD from the University of Colorado in History. Haggerty teaches courses in human, economic, and energy resource geography at MSU. She also leads the Resource and Communities Research Group in studying the ways that rural communities respond to shifting economic and policy trajectories, especially as they involve natural resources. Partnerships and collaboration with diverse stakeholders are central to her approach. She has expertise in diverse rural geographies, including those shaped by energy development, extractive industries, ranching and agriculture, and amenity development and conservation. Now, this expertise has informed and benefited from active participation in local, state, regional, and national policy dialogues. In 2023, Haggerty completed the training to become a certified ambassador of applied compassion through the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research at Stanford University's School of Medicine. With that, Julia, the floor is yours.
Well, it's really great to be here tonight, and feeling grateful for a little more moisture coming down here in Bozeman. And I see some familiar faces and names, and it's just really, I'm grateful to the technology gods that allow us to be together in this way, although it would be really nice to be up there in person together. So I'm gonna, not do it that way. Is this looking okay, Haley?
That looks perfect. Yep.
Great. Okay, well, I just would set my intention for tonight that I feel really humbled to be here. I feel like all of you are the experts in demonstrating resilience and practicing community resilience. And really, in my life, I learn from all of you, and including in my scholarship. So with that, my hope is that I can just help facilitate or encourage some dialogue and some conversation in this group by providing some information and some kind of signposts or guiding ideas that come from community resilience scholarship, which is one of the areas that I have focused on for some time. So that was an extremely long introduction. Haley, I don't know, I hope I didn't give that to you. Anyways, I don't know that I need to introduce myself any further than that. But what I'm going to do tonight will be, you'll be kind of meeting me more as a teacher and less as a researcher. If you have seen me speak before, you might have seen me share data on things like land ownership change or rural perceptions of different issues. I really want to just use this opportunity to share with you a way that I teach my students about the concept of community resilience, and use that as a way to get this group talking, because really my goal is that being here tonight will give you, if you don't already have it, some language that comes out of the community resilience work and some ways of thinking that might give you some new perspectives on familiar issues that you're working with. So the goal is a little bit of knowledge that you find empowering. And in order to accomplish that goal, we are going to have to get you kind of rolling your sleeves up and using the material a little bit. So what I'll do is just first start with a little bit very basic kind of history and perspective on community resilience as a concept, really what its goal is, why it exists as a concept. And then we will do a couple of different moments of discussion that will draw on your knowledge and your thinking about community resilience. We'll dig a little more into the scholarship. I'll share with you the definition that I've arrived at after kind of 20 years of researching this, which I find really simple and pretty easy to operationalize. And then we'll reach a point in the evening where, depending on how all the conversations went, we'll have kind of a choose your own adventure item. We'll talk, we can come back and talk as a group, or we can dig in further into some of the data sides of thinking about community resilience. So with that, I will just keep going. And I guess a couple things, like I just would love for this to be a space that you feel comfortable throwing questions in the chat, or even just interrupting me. And Haley and Angel, I'm looking to you to navigate that, because I don't always see everything on the screen. But I know that there is a strong culture of politeness and being reserved in rural communities, and this is not the place to exercise that culture. So I really welcome you to just interrupt me whenever you want.
Julia, we will be looking out for those comments. So yeah, if anybody does have something in real time, feel free to go ahead and drop that in.
Awesome. Thanks, Haley. And I guess as you can see from the title, in general, I'm pretty enthusiastic about the concept of community resilience, but I do want you to know that it receives quite a bit of criticism from certain areas of scholarship, and some of that I think is valid. So I will also aim to leave you with just a few cautionary notes as you go forward thinking about this concept. So I always start any conversation about resilience by just recognizing that it was maybe the buzzword of the new millennium. You will have seen, you have your own webinar series called Rural Resilience. It's a term that really replaced kind of sustainability as the operational buzzword of things that we're aiming for as communities, and also in our relationships to nature and to natural resource management. And there are maybe a number of historical reasons that we arrived at the moment in time that we did, when resilience gained so much traction. And unfortunately, I don't have time to go into that, but I bet you could imagine thinking about this era, the turn of the new millennium, and the kinds of things that were arriving upon us as a society, why resilience might seem like an important concept. You probably know that there are a number of variants of the term resilience and of the concept. And they come from, I always tell my students, like, you want to ask, like, what problem is which scholar you're looking at trying to solve? And so the problem they're trying to solve usually influences the questions that they're asking. So resilience is, often described as having its oldest roots in engineering, and really thinking about problems in the physical properties of materials and how much pressure they can sustain before they break. There is a whole school of work in psychology that thinks about resilience in terms of the ability, particularly for individuals, to bounce back from negative emotional experiences. Resilience has been used widely in the kind of human development space to think about the risk of falling into poverty or ill health in the face of major stressors. In ecology, you may know resilience has a really kind of rich history in thinking about ecosystems, their ability to absorb change. And then more recently, there's been a whole school of thought that comes out of combination of kind of social science and ecological science, social ecological systems. One of the ways that, resilience sometimes gets criticized, maybe you've heard this like in your conversations, is like, it's just like a horoscope. It can explain anything to anyone because it is so widely used. So one of the ways that we, as scholars and in our classrooms, encourage students to kind of pin down what they mean when they use the term resilience is always to ask resilience of what to what. So in any kind of system we're describing, we can help understand what we really mean by resilience by asking of what to what. So if we just take those examples we just looked at, and we think about defining it more carefully, we could say, when we're talking about psychological resilience, we're talking about the resilience of an individual's psychological or emotional state to some experience which is really negative or traumatic. When we're thinking in ecology, we're talking about the resilience of ecosystem structure or function to some major disturbance. Often that's in looking at things like big landscape disturbances, fires, big wind events, things like that. So asking of what to what helps us kind of refine what we mean. And the way we think about community resilience kind of borrows from this spirit of thinking about responses to change and focuses on that at the community level. So going beyond the individual, going beyond the household to some kind of meaningful individual scale. Now, defining like what a community is similarly tricky. It kind of is one of those words that you think you know what you mean, it means until you actually have to describe it. But in most of my work, I'm thinking about place as the organizing feature of community. So people who share a physical location, usually some kind of jurisdiction. Now I will say, like, this webinar is a good example. This is a community, but it seems to be largely a community of interest. So here we are on Zoom, all these different locations. There's probably a real sense of shared communities of interest here, but not sharing in a physical place. In my work, I'm thinking about communities as place-based. So we can use this very kind of overarching definition of agency and self-organization in response to change as a definition of community resilience. And we will just start to chip away at like what this kind of abstract thing means as we go. So let's start first by just thinking about, okay, when we're talking about rural communities and the notion of rural communities needing to exercise agency and the ability to self-organize in response to change, again, it's helpful to think about, well, what do we mean? Resilience of what to what? What does a community need to respond to? And what are we talking about in terms of what might be at risk in the case of certain changes? So I'll just encourage you to, we're going to get close to asking you to think of some examples of kind of resilient community responses in a minute. And maybe this kind of catalog that I often use with my students will give you some inspiration. So one of the things that's important, and I'm sure this has been said many times in many of your meetings, it's like, you've seen one rural community, you've seen one rural community, every place is different. And there are many sorts of disruptions and changes that are affecting rural communities and their kind of key vital community assets. So just to run through some different kinds of examples where community resilience is relevant. This slide comes from work done by one of the early scholars in community resilience. She's actually a rural health expert out of Alberta. She's since retired. Her name was Judith Kulig. And she is one of the early pioneers of work in community resilience and used it really to think about rural healthcare, but then as there were a series of really dramatic wildfires in her province, she did a lot of work with the provincial government to look at those fire events and kind of ask what contributed to community resilience. So community resilience in the case of natural hazards is probably its most widespread kind of application. So here and I would encourage you as you think about this, like resilience of what to what. So in this case, the to what is to fire, but we can think about the many things that might be at risk in this case. So a lot of my work, and particularly my early work, trying to understand how communities exercise agency and the capacity to organize in response to change, came out of working in energy boom towns, first even prior to coming to academia. And here is another example. So these would be acute economic stresses. And we can think about both the boom and the bust cycle of being a small town, getting a big new industry, or suddenly losing an industry that you've become really dependent on as really disruptive changes that challenge community resilience. This is a slide that comes from one of my early master's students who was looking at the example of the winter use conflict in West Yellowstone. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, but there was quite a long and sort of drawn out public land use conflict around how to manage snowmobile access in Yellowstone. So we can think of that kind of, it was both a chronic and an acute kind of economic and policy stressor for the community of West Yellowstone. There was just really difficult and hard conversations and a lot of conflict, in this case between largely, not entirely, but to some degree, an outside environmental community seeking changes in land use that really affected certain business owners in West Yellowstone. And you can, well, I won't go into the charts on the right. We can come back to this if you want. But anyways, this is just an example of a community change that was anticipated, was contested, really had to do with a policy decision that people were seeking to influence. This might sound familiar. This is a kind of can be a really disruptive event that creates a need for community resilience. And then finally, I'll just give you an example that we also teach from. There's another geographer who is a really important scholar in this area. His name is Jeff Wilson. And I think Jeff Wilson just wanted to go on sabbatical in Austria, but he went up to this remote valley in the Austrian Alps, this kind of right on the border of Switzerland, and is obviously this beautiful town, but really struggling with a lot of things that would probably sound familiar. They would sound familiar in central Montana. This very remote town that's challenged by these kind of slow onset disturbances, big effects of changes in weather on the pastoral system there, and also just ongoing outmigration of young people and real vulnerability to economic shocks. So there's a really classic study in community resilience that comes out of this mountain town in Austria. And there's an example, again, of not necessarily a single acute shock or change or disruption, but kind of a layered group of chronic slow onset changes. So that's a catalog of some of the kind of to what's that might be relevant in cases where rural communities have to exercise community resilience. So right away, like I said, I want to put you on the spot. And I would like to ask, we're going to go into some breakout rooms, and I think this slide will stay available. It's pretty simple instructions. But I would love to draw on the collective knowledge of this group and think about some familiar examples that come to mind of groups, hopefully communities, demonstrating resilience in the face of disruptive change. And so you might for a minute just talk as a group about some that come to mind, and then choose one that you'll develop as a group and you'll report back to all of us about. So I would love to hear the example that you're focused on, what you know about it. And then I've given you these kind of prompts. So what is the context? What is the disruption that's happening? What was at risk? What could be really disrupted from this event or set of challenges? And what is it that this group or community did, and what made that resilient in your perspective? So it's 7:23. I think this is probably a good 8 to 10 minute conversation, and then we'll come back. And I think it's set up so I can scoot around and visit you. And of course, take some time to visit and introduce yourselves if you don't already know each other, and build some community right now. So Haley or Angel, you can go ahead and throw us into the breakout rooms. Okay, it seems like we have everybody back. I'm sure that you just barely got done introducing yourselves and catching up a little bit, and that's okay. But what I would love to do, just to kind of capture back what we've heard as groups, is just invite a couple of examples. And I just made this table here, which it's not going to probably let me edit. I gotta get out of this mode. I'll just take some notes here on what you share. So is there a spokesperson from one of the groups who's willing to just give an example of a resilient community response that you identified? And I don't think you should. I think it's such a small group. I don't know if this is breaking the rules, Haley, but you should just speak up.
Yeah, go ahead and speak up. I don't think if we talk over each other, we'll just name somebody that gets to go first.
Well, I'll hop in, but we didn't get to the resilience part. We were just identifying, we just got to the disruptor, but a lot of us were in central Montana, and different fires came up, floods came up, APR came up, but we settled on fire. That seemed to be one. And so we were just starting to describe the impact of the fire and how community was starting to respond. So I can't speak for the group on how we were resilient because we didn't get there. But we did find it. We did come up with a disruptor. 2017 fires.
So maybe from that conversation, do you think you could summarize a little bit of what is at risk in that context?
Yeah, well, I think in one of the smaller fires, it was just, almost complete devastation of forage resource for a few ranchers. But in the larger one, it was, it's one of the largest fires in Montana. I think it was 80,000 acres. And so again, how to rebuild, but there were some really fascinating examples of resilience, and I don't know if we want to get into that right now, but yeah, just the loss of forage and infrastructure, the amount of resources had to come into play, the anxiety and trauma that people experienced, but that, a lot of those we get to. I don't have the specific actions, but I should probably let other people talk about theirs, but there was some pretty cool responses in those that I know of, and I wasn't quite in the middle of those communities.
Is there anyone from that group or the group more broadly that wants to share some ideas about what made responses around those fires resilient?
I think that people organized and brought meals They organized and brought water and manpower. And just the fact that there was a personal touch that just kind of helped with all of the stress and anxiety and trauma.
Yeah, that's really nice. I remember that from that time as well.
Neighbors
other-
helping gather cows of other neighbors, just everyone just pulling together, doing what needed to get done, because there wasn't necessarily time to communicate about everything.
Well, and I remember it, even though I'm quite far from that, calling down and paying for $100 worth of fuel.
Yes.
Just so that, you know, things like that. So it reached out of just your area, although it was a very large area, but things like that. So that I think you drew from the community, but you also drew from the surrounding communities that knew what it was like.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful. Well, just in the interest of time, how about one more? Is there another example? I know like it's probably true. There's a lot to talk about, just about talking about the disruption, and that's okay if that's as far as you got. What about another group?
Well, in our group, we identified something that is a not necessarily just a localized issue, but it's about maintaining consistency in our schools as far as employees, whether they're teachers or administrators. There's a high turnover rate in some rural communities, and so that's what we came up as an issue in our group. And you know, it's that's about all the further we really got with it, was that is an issue. And it, because we talked about what's going on in Ecolaka. I talked about an example of a teacher shortage in Malta that we have going on with a position they're having a tough time filling, because there's a shortage of that kind of teacher across the entire state already, and we're without one. So that's what our group kind of got started on.
Yeah, so Perry, will you say a little more about kind of what's at risk when there is a lot of turnover?
Well, I think consistency in how things are done. In some ways, I think back on my own school experience, because I don't have any kids, but there's a sense of security when the administration stays the same. You get to know them and can develop a relationship. So it's about relationships within the school environment too, or the lack of, when there's not consistent teachers. I mean, there's I'm the oldest child in my family of origin, and I remember when my brother went to school, it was always, oh, you're Perry's brother, and so they expected him to behave the same way I did, and he was this total opposite in school, so they got a real shock. But there's that consistency of knowing other family members, and that helps give some comfort and things like that.
Is anything that anyone else wants to add to that school turnover issue?
Yeah, so on that same topic, our response in Ecolaka has been, well, we've kind of had two. We've asked community members to step in, and they are teaching without teaching licenses. They're getting their teaching license as they go, kind of through it, but it isn't a certified teacher in the classroom. There's three solutions. The other one is we're combining classes. And so you have one teacher who's teaching multiple classes, which isn't ideal. That's for budget reasons and because we have such a teacher shortage. And then the third is we have hired a lot of teachers from the Philippines, and they have been wonderful in our community, but they aren't there long term. They're coming and going. And there's also been a little bit of a language barrier, particularly in the elementary, with those Filipino teachers and our English speaking students.
Wow.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah. Well, here's some sort of good data that just helps you, gives you a framework for how we might start just like breaking down a particular event. And part of that is really thinking about, of what to what. So what's at risk, and what is the disruptive event? And I'm going to show you next, like community resilience is kind of known for having really crappy artwork and bad diagrams. I'm going to just show you a really simple way I describe the importance of community resilience. So community resilience, I think, can be a really useful way to have conversations within a community, but often people asking questions about community resilience are really interested in what's happening, what makes one community different from the next. So is there a potential with a wildland fire? Is there potential with a major shortage in the labor force, like the teaching labor force? Is there a potential that one place might respond differently from another place based on its kind of community assets? So community resilience is just basically this idea. If you think about as places go through changes over time, if you have place A and place B, and on that y-axis, so going up, A is in a position where it's starting out with a greater number of assets that contribute to resilience, and B is a place that's starting out with fewer assets that contribute to resilience. And then you have, with my hideous lightning rods, some kind of shock, some disruption. It's a fire, it's a labor shortage, it's an economic issue. And there's a number of places that a community can go on its pathway after that disruption. But community resilience theory stipulates that if you're starting with greater community resilience assets, you have a better chance of adapting and moving forward into a place where you at least preserve those assets or you increase those assets in response to shock. And if you're starting with really depleted assets, you have a disruptive event, you're likely to go on a trajectory where you continue to see depletion of those assets. So we'll talk more about what those particular assets are. And I guess I would say, like, this is what I think community resilience is community resilience is this funny thing where it is the capitals you have, whether you can protect those capitals, like those assets. And so it's a bit of like a circular definition. You're resilient if you have resilient assets. But what community resilience really is can you put those assets to work? So you can have two places that maybe even have similar assets. Let's talk about like two people, each have 2 horses. In theory, it's the same amount of horsepower, but there's one owner that just cannot get those horses to work together, and there's another that can really get them to work together. And so community resilience for me is not only the horsepower, but it is really that ability to put the horses and get them working together effectively. So how community responds and adapts to a challenge in order to conserve or enhance its community capitals really depends on whether it can put those community capitals it has to work. So we could go back to those examples and start to talk through them. But what I'll do now is just tell you a little bit about, give you a couple of examples of how scholars have described community resilience. And then I will also give you a simplified definition that I use. And then we can go from there to talk about more kind of local case studies. So both of these are diagrams made by poor social scientists that don't have like good art staff. But what you can see is there is in both of these diagrams, so one by Judith Kulig, who's a really important early community resilience scholar from up in Canada, and another from a team that comes out of Australia and also Canada on the left, where they're saying, look, here are all the assets that a community has, and they have to be able to draw those assets, create capitals, which make you resilient. But the expression of resilience is the ability to harness and use those capitals together. So in the diagram that's on the left of the screen, you can see things like having positive outlook in the community is an important asset. Having a diverse economy is an important asset. Having relationships to place are important assets. Having social networks, having functional governance, having leadership skills, all of those are elements of resilience, but community resilience is really expressing those in an organized fashion. And in the diagram on the right, which Judith Cooley put together, there's a similar set of assets that are described, and she comes out of a community psychology background. They really have to do with not only sort of social infrastructure, but also what we would call affect, like how people are projecting, how people are vibing is how I would call it. Like, do people have skills to cope with divisions? Can they resolve conflict? Do they get along well? Do people have the ability to cope with change as a sort of psychological phenomenon? Is there leadership? Do they have good community problem solving skills? What is their outlook? And all of those in Judith Kulig's model have to interact functionally together. They get, creates a sense of community, and that sense of community allows the community to take action or it's in response to some disruptive event. So I think that all is probably pretty intuitive. And I'll share what I think the key assets are in this space between like all the individual capitals that you might need as a community and your ability to put them together. So when I think about agency and self-organization in response to change, and all of the cases I've seen of communities dealing with major disruptions, whether those are natural hazards, whether they're chronic economic and population decline, whether they're acute economic booms or economic busts, I think there are some common kind of features of what allows groups of people who share a community to act together effectively to respond to those changes. And this is my very simple heuristic, and I'll tell you what it means here. So when it comes to like harnessing those forces and putting them together, my work has suggested that there are these kind of 4 key features. In order to utilize all the assets that you have in a community that might be resilience building assets, you really need leadership. All right, so you need individuals who are willing and able to take the lead, who can organize and who can cooperate. So I'll just maybe make this touchdown with an example of some of my early work, which was working out in Eastern Montana during the Bakken boom and studying how local government was responding to all of the overwhelm that came for public services associated with a rapid influx of people. And that was everything from mental health care to public safety, to roads, to water and sewer, all those things quickly overwhelmed in a place that was not getting resources adequately to respond to those issues. And the case that we developed really in depth in our research was understanding the role of actually a public health coordinating network to respond to those challenges. And one of the things that was necessary to put that network together to enable Sydney and Richland County to have a robust response is just some individuals who are willing to step a little bit outside of their assigned role so that they could take leadership in building a network that worked across, in this case, worked across like the faith community, worked across local government boundaries, worked across agencies. And so there was leadership required in just being willing to say, hey, we've got to get together above and beyond our individual groups. And then the particular people who are involved in leading that were just people that other people wanted to follow because they were sort of the right personalities to do that. Process is something that I think is incredibly important. And this has really been reinforced by some of the climate adaptation scholarship as well. When you have, and I'll say like in the case that you gave of maybe the lodgepole fire, when you have a crisis hit of some kind, you don't want to be trying to write the phone tree, right? You want to have the phone tree that already exists. And so this matters to rural communities. So like efforts like doing planning, any kind of group that meets on a regular basis, sometimes those groups I often hear are frustrated because they're like, we want to get something done and we haven't gotten anything done. But it's hard to overestimate how important that group and that network is when something unexpected happens. And it's not just the network, but it's the habits the fact that you can sit down and get through the phone tree, that's an example of a process, or you can have a process for solving problems or working through issues that is established that you've already used before a crisis hits. So this is a real call for groups that do planning and other kinds of community development work that sort of builds that muscle around being able to work through problems. All of this, as you saw from the previous diagrams, really emphasizes vision and kind of outlook and what I described as affect. So places, there's just so much evidence that resilience is really closely tied to people's ability to see a forward-looking and positive future, and to share that with their community. And then finally, like the way that this is my own word for something that is often called different things, but when we talk about networks as key to your ability to like harness those forces, what I'm talking about are not just what exists in your community that might be like process and groups that are well organized, but really the systems that are going to bring ideas and resources in. So again, that example from the fire, those communities, 3 communities away, or even in the case of Garfield County, people growing hay who were connected through social media and through a shared culture from many other states away. Those networks, when they're in place, are so critical because they allow the exchange of ideas and resources that are critical often, especially in the case of like small, remote, rural communities. It is important that new resources, whether those are financial resources or cultural resources or human capital, they need a way to get in. And then, of course, there's lots of great things that come out across those networks. Shared learning, helping understand, what's happening in these ranching communities. So for me, like when I think about these networks, I think any chance that a small rural group or an organization representing a small rural place, any chance they have to go out and connect with like, I would just say the outside world and other sources of resources, the better. And an anecdote I'll tell about that, again, coming from the oil and gas world, is in Wyoming, when the shale boom was on and places were really suffering from a huge amount of overwhelm and limited local capacity. State government was not ready to act to make some big policy changes that would have helped some of these places. But individuals in state government had resources that could help those communities. And it was really the relationships between individual county commissioners or even county staff and people in the governor's office that helped bring some really critical resources in. And those were, personal relationships that had been established over time. So that's a pretty literal example, but this idea of being connected out so that resources can come in, I think is pretty vital. Okay, so we can go in one of 2 directions. It's 7:55. There's a lot of knowledge and, probably opportunity to visit in this room. I would love to hear in a discussion that we could do in 2 breakout rooms again, and then come back together, your perspective on strengths and weaknesses when it comes to kind of community resilience in the space that you're working in. I also have some slides about measuring community resilience that they get really technical and they're kind of research oriented. So I would maybe let Haley and Angel kind of give us some direction. Is it time for a nice group discussion? I would love to hear what people think.
And I think everybody should have, is there a raise hand feature on here, Angel? I don't know that I'm seeing it on mine.
Should be, it's under reactions if anyone can.
So why don't we go ahead and let you guys vote? If you want to go into a breakout room, go ahead and raise your hand under the reactions tab right now. And if you want to stay with what we're hearing from Dr. Haggerty, excuse me, and have her go into some of that more heavy research, just go ahead and keep your hand lowered. All right, I'm not seeing much for raised hands, Doctor, so it looks like they want to
Okay.
hear you go into some of your research.
All right.
I'd also offer we could, since there's not as very many of us, we could just discuss your question, Dr. Haggerty, as a group with, the 15 of us.
That's great too. Yep.
Yeah. Well, let me see what we have here in terms of, I think it will make sense to just I can talk a little bit about some of the approaches to measuring community resilience, but I won't go into lots of detail. I'll just give you a quick overview, and then I'll close and we can either wrap or we can have discussion, whatever people are up for. So let me just do it that way.
Great.
Okay, so I'll just, so can it be measured? Like, is there either an objective or a subjective way to measure and assess community resilience? Because, I mean, hopefully I've made the case that this is an important dimension of well-being in rural places. There's lots of attention on how we measure resilience. And, again, as I said, like, when I communicate to my students to think about like why people are doing what they're doing, the context in which you're seeking to measure community resilience has a big influence on kind of what your approach might be. But a couple of examples that I share with my students, I guess I would just say that there's lots of ways to measure community resilience. The best way to think about measuring community resilience is with it having like kind of two benefits. One is the ability to make really quick and pretty, what is the word? Just identify high level differences between places. So when we use what we would call like proxy data, so when we create big aggregate maps of things we can measure from publicly available data, what we're doing best is not saying, this is your level of community resilience, but we're saying, hey, this place based on all these assets looks like it might be more resilient than that place. That's what I would call like a quantitative approach using proxy data. And I'll show you quickly an example of that. In a lot of cases, if you really want to understand what's happening in a community, it can be nice to mix approaches that are both quantitative and qualitative. So in the case of the fire study that Judith Kulig did, there's a lot of interviewing, collecting stories, and there's also a systematic survey, and I can show you what those survey questions look like. And then similarly, the case of the town event in Austria, the study to assess resilience there mixes a whole bunch of things that would be kind of objective factors with also some subjective interviewing. And I just emphasize here that like, it's really hard to get an absolute value for community resilience. And often we can think of it being most valuable as helping us think about, is our resilience better or worse over time, or how is one place different from another place? Let me just try to keep this kind of top level here. But one of the major uses of community resilience is to think about natural disasters like fire and flood. And so the slide that you see here is material from FEMA, from the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And one of the tools that they have many tools for assessing resilience, and I won't get into all of them, but there is a resilience analysis and planning tool, which is meant to give you that quick look at which places are more or less resilient. And it's really meant to facilitate the work of emergency managers. And one of the ways that they measure community resilience, if you look over on the right of the screen, is that they have an index that looks at all the things that pose challenges to communities self-organizing with agency to take a response. And this again is in the case of like disasters. You can see these are all publicly available data. And they index all of those and they can create a value for, in this case, they do it for census tracts and they also do it at the county scale. And so as an example of what that looks like, you can, if you Google FEMA wrapped tool, you could pull this data visualization, this map up. I just made a static slide, but here we are up in the CMR area. Here's Blaine County, here's Phillips County. And these are the publicly available data for all these indicators. They get crunched into an index, and a manager, this map isn't colored, but if it were, they would see Blaine County look really dark purple, and they would see Phillips County looking, I think, sort of medium purple, because this index, the higher the score, the more challenges you have to resilience.
Do you want any hot sauce?
Yeah, I'll do a little more.
And in Phillips, so Phillips County gets a score of 52. Blaine County gets a score of 90. And I'll just run quickly through these, and we can come back if there are questions about them. I talked about this post facto study of the fire in Slave Lake that Judith Kulig did. These are figures from the report that they did, where they just asked, like, how was this fire experienced and what made for a resilient response. And in this, they did both interviews with many residents, and then they also did a quantitative survey. And this survey comes out of a lot of work that Judith Kulig has done. And this really captures that, what we call perceived community resilience. So you can use this as a survey to generate data from community members about their perception of how resilient their community is. And you can see these things that people are asked to score. How much of a sense of pride is there in my community? Do leaders listen to me? Does my community have strong leadership? And what that will give you is scores that, again, reflect they're most valuable in seeing differences between places, between two different places, or in places over time. And we actually used this instrument in some research we've been doing with partners at University of Montana around rural water infrastructure. And so this is just an example of like what the results look like. So we did, if you see down in the bottom right in purple, we surveyed people in Anaconda, in Deer Lodge, and then a large kind of rural sample that is mostly in Fergus County. And the survey had lots of things in it, but it included this measure of community resilience that you can see in the upper left. And you can see you get, because people score from 1 to 5, you get aggregate answers for all the responses that are somewhere on that scale. And I'm trying to think of some of the ones that came out as really distinctly different. So interestingly, like somewhat lower score in Deer Lodge about people being open to new ideas than in the Fergus County Judith River Basin sample. And maybe not surprisingly, a higher sense of feeling somewhat isolated from other parts of the state, which is kind of logical given the geography there. So this is just an example of what that IPCR looks like. And again, it can help you think about the differences between places or how places change over time. And again, this is like subjective data reported by people about their perceptions of the community. And I mentioned that the scholar, Jeff Wilson, goes to Austria. And what he did was a whole mix of really intensive, going door to door, capturing lots of attributes about the community. And he looked at all of these different indicators that mostly he collected in some mix of secondary and interview data. And I apologize, the slide is really kind of more set up for students. But he takes those results, and this is kind of classic Jeff Wilson. He looks at resilience scores across different domains in this community. So we remember this is this remote mountain town. It's been suffering kind of chronic population loss. He's asking how vulnerable are they, or how resilient will they be in the future? He says they're really vulnerable in terms of political and natural domains because they're really vulnerable to climate change, moderately resilient economically and socially, and the most resilient is the cultural domain. And so, he assesses this as a place that is at most moderately resilient in the face of continuing shocks. So that's kind of an example of like how collecting all this data, putting it into this framework ends up with some observations about the community. Okay, so I said I would just talk about some weaknesses and problems with this concept. I'm going to try to talk plainly about things that scholars really fight about. Here are 3 things. Community resilience. Well, I will say like one major critique is that it's very hard to measure, and people really fight about kind of how accurate the measurements are. But I think there's also these conceptual problems. And so this is like, okay, thinking about you all in your amazing work that you do leading your communities and thinking about the resilience of individuals and families, and will your community, thrive into the future. One of the criticisms and problems that can happen is like the idea that we valorize or we celebrate communities solving all their own problems. And this expression community as trapdoor actually comes out of urban scholarship looking at the idea of like neighborhood policing. So neighborhood policing can seem like a really resilient response, but it only has to happen when the state fails neighborhoods and fails to have enough police officers. So there's the risk that if we like celebrate resilient responses, we can lose track of the responsibilities that larger society has to individual communities to make sure that they can thrive. So this idea of a trapdoor is like, hey, we can give these problems to the community, close the door and not think about them anymore. That's one of the criticisms. Another one is just to be really, really careful when we use language around community, because it is easy to assume when we are an member of the community that it is an inclusive term. But just because you live in a place doesn't necessarily mean that you feel like you're part of a community. So really thinking carefully about, whether or not the definition and the function of community is inclusive or excludes certain people is super important. And then finally, there's just real questions often, like the smaller the community dynamic, we can kind of celebrate community and ignore lots of unhealthy power dynamics that can exist within that kind of unit, within that community unit. So I won't say more about that, but that's a kind of a key issue in the scholarship. So I still like this. This is the last slide I have. This is a terrible graphic, but I do it because I really do appreciate this scholar. What I find useful about the community resilience framework, one is I think it's pretty intuitive. People can relate to it, use it, employ it in their lives. And it really combines my appreciation as a historian for change over time with like this idea of measuring, thinking about where we are right now. And so here is just a graphic that again asks, okay, if a given place has more or less sort of positive resilient assets, that level of sort of thriving can change over time. And we think a lot in our group about the corridor that a community goes through over time. So let's just, to make this a little more concrete, let's just say we're talking about a small community in Montana. It is going to go through changes where its different levels of capital, social capital, economic capital, environmental capital will fluctuate. And at times it may experience some really dramatic shocks. And those, as we said, can push the community into different trajectories. And then there is also this idea that communities themselves, I guess the thing that's important about this graphic is this idea that the trajectory that your community goes through does have boundaries around it that come from outside largely. So a lot of like the operating space that you have to make decisions is not set up by the community itself. It's set up by global markets. It's set up by external policy. Maybe it's set up by really dramatic, kind of weather patterns. So where a community can go is really not only influenced by its own decisions, but by what's coming from outside. And one of the things that, Jeff Wilson, the scholar that we admire, encourages us also to think about are like, when are those times that communities break free of that corridor of change and really pursue some radical pathways that are transformative in ways that really accelerate and amplify resilience. So the pathways kind of thinking is something that has always really appealed to me, as well as just the kind of basic common sense nature of community resilience. So that's what I have for you. And I can maybe, as a starting point, go back to the question. And I'm happy to let people get on with their chores tonight, or talk more, or go to any of these slides. So be quiet and I'll listen to what you have to say.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Haggerty. And we'll go ahead, and the chat is now open. If anybody does have a question or wants to jump into this discussion slide that's on the screen, please let us know, and just type into the chat there, and I'll get that orated over to Dr. Haggerty. As we do wait for that, the one question that popped into my brain, and I'm thinking about community as a very simple form of a community being a small town community, and looking at all these pieces for resilience. And the question popped into my brain as to whose job is it to make sure that we have this in place? Is it the chamber? Is it the city council? Is it a county commissioner? Who is the person who theoretically should be the one making sure that these pieces are all tied together? Do you see a commonality amongst rural communities as to who takes that on?
That's such a good question. And I think I take as a starting point the assumption that there is no one person, or entity that is like fully deputized to do that. And so that's such a good question. I mean, again, I think it would fall, there's a way to parse that question out based on, like, are we talking about disaster response, in which case we do have some kind of, assignments within that area. But even within that, as I mentioned, in the case of like Eastern Montana, there really is a need to collaborate across kind of jurisdictional silos. And so, whose responsibility is it? I mean, that's a question I would maybe put back out to you, but like, one way to think about it, and I think it gets into like kind of your values pretty quickly, is like, whose responsibility isn't it, right? And it is probably not the responsibility of the most vulnerable people in your community. It's probably, to some degree, the responsibility of those people who have some capacity to act.
So I'll put that into a little bit more of a tangible example for what I witnessed during the lodgepole fire, because that's the one that was by Jordan, correct? So we, as a community in Glasgow, we, of course, were responding to that fire as it was people who were close by, and sending trailers, and trying to do the best that we could as a supportive neighboring community. And then I got into the idea of, wow, what if we are next? Are we in the correct shape to handle this? And specifically, what I was noticing amongst women my age was that they were having a hard time finding people to watch their kids so that they could do the tasks that needed to be handled. And so that was my thinking. Like, do we have some, a mom that could take on 6 extra kids for a weekend if somebody's ranch is threatened, type of an idea? And I got kind of shushed, and they said, of course, we already have that in place. So-and-so and so-and-so do that. And I thought, well, I wouldn't have had any idea unless I asked that question. And there's no sense in making the wheel again if somebody else has already handled it. But the knowledge wasn't out there community wide, I don't think, as to the systems actually being in place.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think what I actually hear in that question is like, there's an absence of a process for kind of doing some of that planning, right? And like, and maybe a little bit of cultural resistance to it, which is not unusual. But it would, if things got really bad and you hadn't been part of a process that identified those resources, and you weren't in the phone tree, like, overall, it would weaken your community's resilience, because it would take you out of the group that can help respond. So to me, that's a case of like the necessity to have these processes that bring people together on an ongoing basis to kind of map what's happening and to like build that shared knowledge, whether that is a natural resource collaborative process or it's a planning process. Like, yes. And then if people are resistant to those conversations, like, that is probably a less resilient kind of attribute of the community. And I can say that from my place down here in Bozeman. I know people, there's limited time. Everybody's got things they have to do. I get that.
It looks like Butch also has a question for us. So Butch, I'll go ahead and let you ask that if you'd like to.
Okay, it's more of a comment than anything, I guess. But since the government was mentioned, and I got my Senate hat too, so was something about government isn't always the way out. But I was just, it got me thinking though of all the different places we can go for help. And I think you've experienced it, Haley, with the fire and everything like that. But whether it's your network, Western Ag Network, Northern Ag Network, we got all of our livestock associations, our grain associations that are, and then our own Department of Agriculture. I know I can act as a liaison between different communities. So I think there are a lot of, getting back to that deal though, if you don't know it or you don't think about it, you don't know what you have available. But there probably are quite a few things that can help out. And I'm not a big fan of, I don't think government's usually looked at very favorably, coming in and saying, hey, I'm going to fix all your problems, because you usually don't work. I think that does have to be done at the local level. But if government can assist in some way, shape, or form, as well as our livestock associations, our grain association, I think that's what does allow us to do some pretty neat work sometimes on these big, like the big fire, for example. That was quite a project.
And this is Doreen, real quick, just saying thank you so much for doing this, Haley.
Absolutely. It's a whole team of people, but we're happy to have you guys join us. All right, Dr. Haggerty, any response to that from Butch?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I hear is like the couple of things. One is just the value on like local solutions for local problems, and not being, not like maybe having had great experiences with the government trying to solve problems, and what I like is this idea of like, how do we use government in a way that responds to our priorities, and knowing what those priorities are is like a really important first step and first piece of that. And then I also hear just this idea that we can use existing organizations, whether they're, public or private, that have those networks in place to help build that connectivity between us and, our other partners. So that, I really hear that. And I think that clearly in the case of like rural agricultural networks being connected, because you're so few, you're very mighty, but you're so few, you absolutely have to connect out within the larger kind of ag community network. At the same time, you build connectivity into like other sources of ideas and thinking, because I mean, one of the things, Tara, I really want to hear what you have to say. And I see Bill has a question, but one of the things that came out of this work on the West Yellowstone project was pretty interesting. So my student and I both thought it would be super interesting to see how the community managed this longstanding, like fraught political conflict, and all this concern about like what was going to happen with the number of snowmobiles changing. And that, it's completely understandable why that was such a big focus for the community, because there were a number of businesses very, very dependent on lots of snowmobiles in winter. But the big thing that has changed West Yellowstone is international tourism and outside capital that is buying property to support that international tourism. And that all was developing kind of at the same time that the community like had its head down and was just so focused on what was going to happen around winter use. And in fact, like neither the Park Service nor local government nor state government, no one anticipated the scale of the impact around international bus tourism in West Yellowstone. And that turned out to be like the big disruptive event that has changed the trajectory of that community forever. And so there's also just this thing of like, we want to be able to not be so focused on like a narrow set of problems and things that are happening that we keep our eye off whatever the metaphor is. Tara, go ahead.
I just have a very specific question on that wrapped tool slide that you had. I think, did you have Malta on there? Is that what the example you used?
The counties.
Okay, yeah. So Phillips. Okay, so the community or the index percentile, 52 out of 100, is that 52% on the good side or the bad side? Like that.
So
let's say you're 90.
Yeah. It is. So let's just say Blaine County is a little bit easier to explain. This means that there are only 10% of all of the counties in the index that have greater challenges to resilience than Blaine County. So that's a very troubling score, right? Meaning there's lots of indicators here that show there's lots of challenges in marshaling a resilient response. And so in Phillips County, like roughly half of the group in the sample has greater threats and half of the group has, sort of better resilience factors, if you will. So it's a measure of challenge. The higher it is, the bigger the challenge. But
Excellent.
It's not about
Thank you.
like how much, it's not like how bad is the climate risk or how bad is the fire risk. It's about like sort of how weak are the local assets. And I hesitate to use that language because it's the places that you people, you live. And so like, I don't see it that way, but this is also just speaks to like, when you talk about publicly available data and you have potentially like a demographic, a population that really skews the data, you're going to see those differences come out in that way.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, and then I think
Bill's question.
Yeah, I think Bill's question here is probably a great place for us even to wrap up tonight, unless we do have time for another question if anybody has one that's burning. But in Bill's question I had a very similar one here in how do you actually sell this? Because obviously the people that are with us here tonight are with us because they want to see something like this improve in whatever their community is. And so Bill's question kind of goes to the heart of that. And do you find communities even willing to transparently ask if they are more or less resilient or not? And in the absence of a disruption, do they intentionally plan to become more resilient?
I mean, the answer is no. Like there's a real reluctance to, and it's completely understandable, right? Like there's lots of explanations for that, but I don't know. I just feel like I can plainly say the longer that I'm around, the more obvious it is that just maybe as a species, we're pretty crisis driven, when it comes to making change, and sort of taking proactive action. I think you could look at some different international contexts and maybe see some more differences around that. There is more planning in more authoritarian regimes. There's also more planning in more socialist regimes. There is the least amount of planning in liberal democracies that really privilege like individuals as an ideology. So that's my academic answer. But I think one of the things I would just say is like, one of the reasons I use this really plain language is that I think a lot of what is happening in community development cultivates these kind of assets anyways, without having to call it community resilience or do a resilience assessment. So it's like sort of complementary without having to like set that aside. But, I do think one of the stories that I take away from the Garfield County example, we've talked about it, is like they have gotten more and more resilient to fire with the series of fires that they've had. And I think what I didn't live there, but I've listened to and sort of thought about it as a case, like I do see some real efforts to learn from the past experiences and prepare for the next ones. And there won't be any shortage of kind of natural hazards in the future. So, maybe this tool, even if you do have to wait for a crisis, maybe it's useful in that moment of after kind of learning from the crisis.
All right. Are there any last questions for Dr. Haggerty? Well, we've got our expertise with us tonight.
Butch has his hand raised again.
Oh, do we? Okay. Butch, go for it. And you're on mute, Butch.
There, that work?
That worked. Yep.
Okay, I just wanted to give kudos to a number of our county agents from around the state have been doing these workshops within their local communities and on resilience and what does it take. And some of them have had like 4 or 5 meetings. We just finished one up in Cut Bank. And I know they pointed, I see Ecological was on the screen here, but that was another one that they quoted some pretty thoughtful results from Ecological, I think, at one of ours. So anyway, kudos to our county agents for working hard and getting this out there anyway. So something we can feed off from anyway.
Yep, absolutely. All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And Julia, thank you as well. We have known that we wanted to have some sort of an educational piece with Dr. Haggerty for quite some time. And we were just waiting for that right moment. And this one presented itself. And so we were ecstatic that this worked out this evening. Now, Angel is dropping a post-event survey into the chat. We'd love to hear your feedback there. Any criticisms you have, we're into constructive criticism. Any suggestions you have for future topics, we'd love to get that in that format as well. So please take the time to check that out. It's a very brief survey and you can fill that out. Now, I do also want to mention that we have number 4 of our 4-part series coming up the 4th Thursday of April, so about a month away now. And we're going to have Montana Ranchers Beef joining us. And so it's 3 women out of central Montana that do direct to consumer beef marketing. And we're not doing your typical type of discussion of this because we really want this to be a more rural look at direct-to-consumer beef marketing, and that we know there's not a packing plant, within 10 miles for everyone in the state of Montana. And of course, in Phillips and Valley and Blaine counties, the counties that we're most familiar with, everybody's already got a freezer that's full of a half of a beef. And so how do you market to people that already have a lot of protein in their freezer? And those are some of the challenges that the Montana Ranchers Beef is going to take just a very realistic look at. So that'll be the 4th Thursday. Because you signed up for tonight's Rural Resilience webinar, you're already signed up for that one, and we'll be sending you some reminders. It'll be that same link that you used tonight for that. And then also coming up, May 11th is a huge day for the Ranchers Stewardship Alliance. We are doing an in-person event with Jolene Brown. And for folks that know Jolene Brown, I know that you can vouch for her. She is a great national speaker. If you haven't heard her yet, I promise you won't be disappointed. She is going to be joining us in Malta. We will be at the Malta High School May 11th, and it's going to go from around 9 to 3. So it'll be a mostly full day event, but some time to drive on both sides of that. And she's going to be presenting the positives of passing it on. Basically, she is giving the older generation in ranching permission to retire and kind of giving you some ideas about what that can look like for you and showcasing that it's not a cookie cutter situation. She's also going to be joined by an accountant, an attorney, as well as a financial advisor that'll all be joining her when we do that presentation. So again, that's coming up May 11th in Malta. We don't have a registration quite set up for that, but we will be putting it out into our newsletter, which you all will now be getting because you're part of our RSA group, and we'll let you know once that sign up does open. So again, thank you to Dr. Julia Haggerty. Thank you to Angel DeVries for handling our tech tonight. And thank you to all of you for joining us for Rural Resilience. We'll be back in again the 4th Thursday of April.